Welcome to today's SCA webinar with the Value of Information Min Kit, Justifying Information and the Tie to Future Decisions It Impacts with Luis Mendoza. Before I introduce Luis, I'd like to remind the audience that you are muted and you can ask questions during the presentation using the GoToWebinar question feature. We'll cover the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Elaine, can you hear me? So
yes.
There seems to be a sound issue on Luis's end. Luis, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Susan.
All right.
He may have his headphones muted.
Yeah, he may need to leave and come back. So we'll try to troubleshoot the issues that he's having with the audio. And I will go ahead and start with slides to introduce him while he's doing that. So today's presentation is the Value of Information Min Kit, Justifying Information and the Tie to the Future Decisions It Impacts. The presentation will begin shortly, and our presenter today is Luis Mendoza. Luis is a principal consultant at Decision Frameworks, and he's also a Decision Analysis Fellow at the Society of Decision Professionals. He joined Decision Frameworks over a decade ago, and since then he's been engaged with a variety of different projects related to decision analysis and decision quality around the world. He's also been involved in value of information and looking at renewable energy, R&D, technology maturation, and various economic evaluations. At Decision Frameworks, Luis also teaches training courses on the fundamentals of and applications in decision analysis, decision quality, including value of information. He's presented at several industry and discipline events. Luis holds a bachelor's in industrial engineering from Texas A&M, a master's in systems engineering from University of Texas at Arlington, and has completed coursework in the PhD program at the University of Texas at Austin. So together with his colleague, Alan Cooper-Smith, Luis teaches a course for SCA called Introduction to Decision Framing. And this course is offered at the first of the year, January 28th in 2025. It's a one-day course, and so it should be one that you want to put on your calendar. You can see the learning outcomes are listed there. There's also a second course that's scheduled for February 18th in SCA's Houston office. This will also be co-taught by Luis and Ellen Cooper-Smith, and the date of this course is February 18th. The title of the course is Justifying Data, Value of Information. And you can see the course description listed there as well as the learning outcomes. So we have a number of in-person courses coming up. Best practices for new well fracs and legacy well completions, November 14th and 15th in Houston. Applied subsurface geologic mapping, December 2nd through 6th in Houston. Pore pressure, fracture pressure, and wellbore stability, December 9th through 13th in Houston. And then cement repair workshop, December 9th in Houston. So please sign up for those courses today. Many of our courses are taught in public format. Those that were just listed are taught in our Houston office, but you can also schedule these courses to be taught as a private offering in your own office, or you might want to host one of our public courses, particularly if you're in a location outside of Houston. We also also offer a few of these courses in a live online format. We started doing live online during the pandemic, and it was a popular option for some of our courses. And so if you're interested in that, please contact our training department, and you can see the contact information is listed there. And again, SCA offers consulting, training, and recruitment. So look to us for all your training needs. And I'm going to run a poll. Luis, can you hear us?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to launch one of the polls that we have to learn a little bit more about the disciplines of our audience. And so the first poll is, what is your primary discipline? And we are getting some geoscientists in the crowd, quite a few geoscientists. We have some petrophysicists and we have other. And so it looks like we have a good number of you who have voted. So I will close the poll and share the results. We are 71% geoscientists, 14% petrophysics, and 14% other. So let me share the next polling question. And the question is, how many years of full-time experience do you have in the upstream oil and gas industry? So it looks like we have a very experienced group. We're still receiving responses, but quite a few of you have over 30 years experience. So I'll go ahead and close the poll, share the results. 43% have over 30 years experience, and then the rest of the audience is split between 11 to 20 years and 21 to 30 years. So we have one final question that is relevant to this presentation today, and we want to know how familiar are you with value of information and developing the trees for decision analysis. Looks like we have quite a few of you who are very familiar, but there are some in every camp. So almost all of you have voted. So let me go ahead and close and share those results. 14% are very familiar, 29% are familiar, 43% are somewhat familiar, and 14% are not familiar. I want to learn more. So that's great. So now I'm going to present the sharing change presenters to Luis so he can start his presentation.
Excellent, thank you, Susan. Luckily, excuse me, I had my little cough attack while you guys were looking at the poll views, so you couldn't see
Good,
me really
we're ready
coughing
to
into
go.
it. All right.
Excellent.
There we go. Okay, so can you see my screen? All good?
Yes.
Okay,
Looks good.
perfect. So thank you very much. I just want to say that backing up, the title of this webinar is the value of information min kit, how to justify information and the types of future decisions that the information impacts. Right, and so I see that from the audience we have a good group of geoscientists and a few petrophysicists. So I think this is obviously going to be very relevant. And the title of the webinar certainly attracted you into this session. So thank you for joining, and thank you, Susan, for that nice introduction. So what are we going to cover today? That we've done most of the introductions. I will talk a little bit about what decision frameworks is, what kind of a company it is. We're going to talk about the principles of the agile value of information, and so I'll add a disclaimer or a little bit of a intro as to what we mean by the agile component of it, fundamentals of VOI itself and the workflow, and how this min kit actually takes it or reflects a subset of the fuller workflow, and then go into the core case example using that workflow and using the tools as well. So before I move on to this next slide, I just do want to remind everybody that these webinars are intended for educational purposes, and they contain intellectual property, which is used in training, our training. To protect this material, we ask that you please refrain from unauthorized recording of these sessions. If you would like to have a repeat of the webinar, you can contact us, SEA as well, and we can schedule a rebroadcast or bring it in as a lunch and learn for your team, similar to the description that Susan included at the beginning. And this webinar is being recorded. Okay, so who are we? Who is Decision Frameworks? We are a decision quality enablement firm, right? So we do have some consulting, and as you can see, just from the little call-outs, the little mottos for each one of the services, we bring clarity, confidence, and ownership to complex decision problems. From the consulting side, we engage with teams on kickstarting projects from a decision analysis, decision quality standpoint, but also, and very importantly, is that we are in addition to consulting, we offer training, and we have our software. That's our own proprietary software. So for the training, we develop and reinforce the internal decision knowledge and build lasting capabilities so that you can take these learnings, these concepts, and apply them into your own workflows as well. And then for the software, you're going to see some of that in this session. And what we do there is we empower teams and companies to apply decision quality principles, right? So decision quality in and of itself is not it's not rocket science. It's not brain surgery. It is just a simple, a clarified approach, if you will, to making decisions facing uncertainty, right? I am Luis Mendoza, and I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Susan and SEA, for including us in this webinar. A little bit more about Decision Frameworks, lastly, is that it is a company that's celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, right? So it was founded in 1999 by Ellen Coopersmith, who you saw in some of these introductory slides. She's very well known among the DADQ world, particularly within the oil and gas industry. And of these 25 years of Decision Frameworks, I've been on board for 13 of those, so just a little bit over half of the life of the company so far. If you have any further questions about Decision Frameworks itself, you can just look us up at decisionframeworks.com. Okay, so the goal of this webinar is to show you how you can easily do a preliminary scoping of a VOI decision in about an hour, right? Obviously, there's a little bit of a learning curve, and in the G&G space and upstream, we know all about learning curves and whatnot. But in about an hour, once you get the hang of it, and there are decisions that necessitate bringing in elements of a fuller VOI workflow, but we're going to talk a little bit about those today. What you see on the screen for principles of agile value of information, and I'm pausing on that agile, because agile itself, at least from a software development perspective, which obviously this is not it, but we're just kind of taking from it, is the adaptability feature. But what we take into account when we talk about agile for VOI in particular, this min kit, is that we're considering the focus on the people doing the work and how they work together. Right. So that's what we're taking into account here. And what you'll see is that obviously as a G&G specialist, as a geoscientist or a geophysicist, petrophysicist or whatnot, now you're going to have some very specific functions, and that you're going to need to incorporate additional concepts from the multidisciplinary team around you. And so this helps perhaps clarify that and see how you can embed the simple VOI approach into those processes. So the hope for this webinar is that at a minimum you walk away feeling a little bit more confident and being able to frame and scope a VOI decision on your own, right? And so with the audience that we have, that's going to be a very relevant topic. So step number one in a VOI is just defining what is the VOI problem itself, right? Identify whether or not there's a business case for the information. Using the VOI min kit as we're approaching it in this webinar, using that min kit to frame. And when we say min kit, it's like the bare bones, if you will, of the approach, right? Focusing on the uncertainty table and bringing it in as a error into the development of the trees, right? And that development of the trees happening with a VOI wizard, right? And so we're going to show you what that entails, and it's just a few clicks away, but it's really more importantly the clarity of the thinking to get into those insights of what new information could be worth, right? What is the value of that new information, and thus the VOI abbreviation. Okay, so what are some of the fundamentals of VOI and the workflow? How can we justify new information to enable better informed decisions? So when we talk about VOI, there's two really distinct products of the VOI exercise. And the first one is a glimpse of the future, right? Meaning the uncertainty that we're facing, how can we better see that uncertainty that we would face after we acquire that new information? Right? So it could come in perhaps in a form of reduction of uncertainty, and also in the better determination, the better understanding of the reliability of interpretation of the experts or of the SMEs, right, through a well-structured expert interview. The other product is the understanding of the monetary impact that the decisions would have, right? Meaning, if we choose to do something differently, what is the potential value gain on how we approach a project? So these better choices with more certainty comes as a result of that, what you see in item number 1, a reduction of uncertainty, right? But there has to be a decision that would change, right? So that you can make the project a little bit better. And over time, you will experience less suboptimal outcomes, less in terms of quantity, right? Not necessarily less in terms of suboptimality, but less in terms of quantity, a number of outcomes. And that's how you avoid value destruction. So real basic principles of VOI is that VOI itself is the asset value with the new information that you're seeking, that you're considering, minus the asset value without the new information. In other words, the kind of clarity that you can gain from the new information minus if you were just to go today, as in if you were to just execute the project the way that you see it today. Right, and so we're going to come back and forth on that one. And then the other key principle is that for new information to add any value at all, there must be a future decision that can change after getting new information. Right, and so I'm going to go a little bit off script here, and I'm going to talk about this particular item. Right, and this is a personal example. When my daughter was about 2.5 years old, coming out of the shower, she slipped and hit her little elbow. And so I took her over to the emergency room, the little urgent care, and from there they sent us over to the pediatric orthopedist. And while we're waiting there, the pediatrician, the pediatric orthopedist comes up and says, we're going to take an x-ray of your daughter's elbow to see if there's a fracture. And I said, okay, great. So pause, that x-ray is the new information or the potential new information. And I said, okay, so doc, so what's going to happen if the elbow is fractured or if there's a fracture in her arm? And the doc says, well, we're going to put her in a cast for about 2 weeks. We really don't want to go any farther than that because it could affect growth. And at this age, they're growing so quickly that the bone would heal very quickly. So 2 weeks would be just about right. And I said, great. And now, out of curiosity, doc, what happens if the x-ray says that there's not a fracture? And the doc says, well, we're going to put her in a cast for about 2 weeks because we want to make sure that there isn't a fracture. And if there is one, then it would heal and 2 weeks would be about enough time. So my DA brain, decision analysis, decision quality brain, quickly went to, okay, so this information, the x-ray, doesn't really have any value because no matter what, the approach is going to be the same. We're going to put a little cast on her arm and she's going to wear that for 2 weeks and that's it, right? And so I, rephrased it and I mentioned that to the pediatric orthopedist and he said, yeah, pretty much, no matter what, we're going to have to cast her. I said, so what's the point in getting the x-ray? Like, why would I have to pay for that? I'll just leave it at that's the end of the conversation. But if anybody's calling in from outside the US healthcare system requires that to be able to move along. And so anyway, so we went ahead and we got the x-ray. But to me, it was very clear there's no value. Why? Because no matter what the outcome of that x-ray or no matter what the interpretation of the x-ray, there's not going to be any change into the approach to helping heal her. So on that, I'll just rephrase and not rephrase, I'll just reiterate that second point, that second bullet point that you see on the screen. For new information to add value, there must be a future decision which can change after getting new information. Okay, now that helps answer the questions, or in order to really be able to determine that, what information is being considered, right? What do we need to, what potential tests, what potential sample can we collect? What is the information that's being considered? What uncertainties will this information in particular address, right? And then what future decisions are hinging on the resolution of those uncertainties? Okay, so to help think through and to help carry the conversation, which is one of the elements of decision analysis itself as an umbrella of where VOI fits in, one of those tools is the uncertainty table. Okay, so what you see on the screen here is an uncertainty table, and we're going to talk about each one of those items, right? So the value of the information itself will depend on the interplay of three important aspects. The first one is, what is the uncertainty today? What is really the magnitude of that uncertainty today? And the chance that will make a suboptimal decision, right? I'm missing the little word decision there. Excuse me. Number two of the three important aspects is a future decision that the information may impact, right? What is the monetary impact, for example, will help us or better understand what is the monetary impact of a suboptimal decision and the pain of making a suboptimal decision from the, call it the downside of that monetary impact. And number three is the accuracy of the information, or how good are we at interpreting that information, interpreting the uncertainty with the information that we collect. So the example that you see on the screen, right, where if we just look at each one of those columns, in the red font is a description of those rows, but the column starts at the blue oval hydrocarbon presence. The decision to change would be whether or not you drill a prospect, and the information sources to consider are seismic, acquiring more seismic, or acquiring new seismic, or drilling an exploration well, and so on. All right, so we'll get into more detail as to what those uncertainty tables are. But this is a really critical step, primarily for the consideration and the clarification. When I say consideration, for the discussions and the clarification that this can bring to your team. Okay, so that uncertainty table is a key step in VOI. Okay, so what do we mean by the min kit, right? The minimum kit, what is the bare bones approach to an actual VOI? The hope here is that you can run this within an hour, right? And so there's really two main parts to working a full VOI exercise. The first one is defining and framing the problem, right? And then the second one is going to be how to evaluate and decide, right? So in defining and framing the problem, we see that we start with the questionnaire, right? The problem definition questionnaire. What is it that we're trying to solve, that we're trying to address, right? And next is how can we describe that within an uncertainty table, right? To help us gain that clarity. And from that uncertainty table, focus our evaluation on one of these uncertainties and one of the information sources, one at a time. Right, and then lastly, building that out for that particular information source, because it has a different reliability than other information sources, building that out into a tree. And then as we build that out into a tree, then we go into the actual evaluation, right? So we start with, if we're going to be able to quantify, if you will, what is the value of the information, as I mentioned, is one of the fundamentals. That VOI, the value of information, is the value of your asset with new information minus the value of the asset without the information, right? So as a starting point, we have to know what is the value of the asset without the new information. So as our current go now case, that's what we would just call in the present without getting the new information. So we've built out that go now tree. Right, we take a look at what would be the maximum value that we could get from information if the added information were 100% reliable. That's that perfect info tree, the second step in the evaluation that you see on your screen, right? Then we talk about the reliability interviews. How reliable is the information that we're collecting? There's no such thing as perfect information, as you all know, but it's important to know what perfect information what value it could bring, so you can see what that upper limit, that upper bound of the value add or of that value uplift will be. Because then from there, it just starts reducing based on the reliability. And then lastly, what is that imperfect information tree? How does that reliability factor in, right? We'll talk about a little bit about the math. There's a much more detailed approach to the Bayesian inversion that we use to be able to, or that not just we, but that is used to be able to determine what that reliability, the impact of that reliability is, and then the potential probabilities of those, or I should say the probability of those potential outcomes. But we won't necessarily address that in detail here. If you have any questions on any of those or anything that we've discussed so far, please feel free to drop them into the question panel here in the GoToWebinar interface. Okay, so can we do it within an hour? I think so, right? I think after you see this a few times, you get the hang of it, you'll be able to sit with the team and within an hour talk about how to lay out this VOI. Of course, you're gonna need some potential inputs from other teams, particularly from the economic side, and we'll see what that means, and for you to be able to determine what that value of the information is. Okay, but beyond the min kits, if we want to, some of the problems themselves are going to necessitate perhaps the full-on kits, right? So what we're going to see today is we're going to talk about collecting core alongside with logs or just logs, right? And we're going to compare those. We'll get to that in a bit, right? But when you're doing something a little bit more complex, like an appraisal strategy, for example, that appraisal strategy itself may require some, like a full-on strategy table for different appraisal approaches, right? Or different appraisal strategy approaches, right? Combination of appraisal wells, or of temporary production, and whatnot. But when we're talking about individual units, the min kits or individual information sources, the min kit is a really good approach for that. Okay, so let me introduce this case study that we're going to cover, and just doing a time check. I think we're right on time, and so certainly feel free to drop in any of those questions into that panel. So this case that we're going to review is just from our organizational wisdom library. We call it OWL. And it's an appraisal value of information case study, right? It's Cuba whole core VOI case study, as you can see from the slide there, from the introduction. Now, this is obviously very simplistic. We call it cartoon of the field and the decision at hand, but let me walk you through it. All right, so the development of the Cuba oil field has progressed from east to west. The Simon well will be drilled and logged, right? And so that is a given decision. Next on, the X-ray well, just to the north of it, may be flush and diagenically altered with quartz overgrowth, right? So those are some background details. Drilling the Simon well provides an opportunity to gain information on the underappraised X-ray location area. So the team has suggested collecting core from the Simon well to better understand the extent of diagenesis at the X-ray well location. Okay, so that's our background. So we're considering two different information sources, right? So in essence, we're looking at two VOIs, right? And so the information source is just the logs versus logs plus core. Okay, so each one is going to have a different reliability. Let's take a look at what that reliability looks like, right? So first is understanding today's view. When we talk about the go now, when we talk about the value of the asset without new information, we have to understand what it is.
So Luis, I think we lost your audio. Okay, Luis, it looks like you're back.
Oh, okay.
We had a glitch for about 3 minutes.
Oh, okay, okay.
I think you're back now,
Let
but
me
you might
back up
want
a
to
little
turn
bit.
off your camera.
Let me do that.
You may have some bandwidth issues. Perfect.
Okay, so let me back up a little bit more. I think I'll just start at this point. Susan, is this about
We
where we
Yeah,
stopped?
we heard the story about the X-ray well, the Simon well, and what your plans are. But I think when you move to the next slide, that's where we lost you. Luis?
Can you see me?
Now we can
I'm sorry, can you
hear
hear me?
you.
Okay,
Yes. Now you can
okay.
start.
All right, perfect. Okay, so we're looking at two separate VOIs. One is with the logs only, and then the other one is with the logs in the core. Right, so with the logs only, we need to understand what is the current state of nature, at least our view of the current state of nature, right? And that is that within the X-ray location, there's either no diagenesis, 10% chance that that's the outcome, 20% chance that there's slight diagenesis, and then the 70% chance that there's severe diagenesis, right? Obviously that has an impact on the producibility of the formation. And so the question is, how reliable is, does the team believe that the logs only can correctly interpret the state of nature? So if the state of nature truly is that there's no diagenesis, with the logs only, the team believes that there's a 60% chance that we correctly interpret that no diagenesis, right? So the misinterpretation gets distributed, right? So if let me see if I can get my laser pointer here. Back out of that. Okay, so you can see my mouse. 60% chance of correctly interpreting, and then the misinterpretation towards a slight diagenesis or misinterpretation towards a severe diagenesis at 20% chance each, right? It may not be quite as symmetrically distributed, particularly around the slight diagenesis, but ultimately what this is reflecting is that the team's belief in the interpretation of the logs only is a 60% chance of getting it right, and then just an even distribution of the misinterpretation, right? So 60% chance when it's slight that we interpret slight, 60% chance that when it is severe, we interpret severe. Now for the logs and core, there's an extra element of information on top of the logs, and so the core adds some reliability to it. So what does that mean? If the formation itself, as we understand it today, if it were to have no diagenesis, logs and core would be more likely to correctly interpret no diagenesis, right, at 80%. So 60% for logs only versus 80% for logs plus core. And the distribution of the misinterpretation is a little bit closer to what could be the closer answer, right? So in the case of slight diagenesis, we're looking at a 80% chance of correctly interpreting there, and for severe diagenesis, all the way up to 95% chance of correctly interpreting severe diagenesis, right? And so if in your experience, if you've seen if you've analyzed core for potential discovery of diagenesis, you may have noticed in that experience in those particular collections that when there is diagenesis, it's easier to spot versus if there's no diagenesis, and maybe you just gather from a different misrepresentative sample. Okay, so that is the reliability of the interpretation itself. Now let's go into how this fits into the min kit. Right, we've talked about the problem itself, meaning should we collect the core as well in the Simon well to give us information about the X-ray well. We're going to build out an uncertainty table. We're going to focus it on one of the information sources, meaning logs only or logs and core, right? And then look at the decision risk timelines and how does that better, how does that guide us through the uncertainty reduction process. Okay, and then in the bottom portion, we'll get to these evaluation and decide steps here in a bit. Okay, so what you see on the screen is a questionnaire, right? To define the problem, we recommend that you fill out this VOI questionnaire, right? It's fairly easy to understand, right? And what I like to tell teams is that even though it seems simple, in fact, some teams sometimes think that it's a little bit oversimplistic, but even though it seems simple, these teams are generally surprised by how much value they find in the discussion of these questions, right? And that value really comes in the form of just clarity of what is a problem at stake and what is a potential approach to that problem, right? So there are a few components here, meaning there's the decision problem. What are we sure that we're addressing the right problem, right? There's the information source that we're going to collect. Then the uncertainty. If you notice, I put in the uncertainties in an oval. That's just to be a little bit more consistent with what you're going to see in the software itself. And then the future decisions in a yellow box, right? Those are going to be the decisions that we can change later on, right? So just being able to answer those questions will bring you a lot of clarity. Okay, now I'm going to change gears here for a bit. Let me bring over D-Trio. Okay, so quick introduction to what D-Trio is. D-Trio is a decision quality or decision framing tool, right? This is proprietary to decision frameworks, right? And so in the problem definition, let me zoom in here a little bit. There we go, problem definition. Should we core the Simon well to help us decide whether or not we should drill the X-ray well location? Simple, should we core the Simon well? All right, some of the key questions that this evaluation should help us answer is the core itself worth the risk and the cost associated with getting it, with collecting it? How much uncertainty reduction can we get from the core relative to logs only versus core and logs, right? Is there any uplift at all if we collect core? We're looking at the problem through EMPV. There are other decision criteria that can be considered, but we're going to keep it simple at that. Okay, so in the min-kit process, we talked about defining the problem statement, and we go right into the uncertainty table, right? And so in this uncertainty table, we have we're going to build it out from top to bottom, as we can see the key uncertainties inherent in the asset. Which one are we looking at? We're looking at, as an uncertainty, we're looking at diagenesis in the X-ray location, right? So diagenesis in the X-ray location. Which decision could it impact? Whether or not we drill X-ray. What information source could we collect? We could collect logs from the Simon well, right? Or logs and core, just do logs plus core, also from the Simon well location. Okay. Now, there could be other uncertainties that would affect here. I'm just going to keep it at diagenesis for the sake of this webinar. Okay. Now, the way to read this is pretty much from top to bottom. What's the key uncertainty that's inherent in the asset? Why do we care? So what's the future decision that could change? That's why we would care, right? And then what can we do about it is the information sources to consider, right? So coming back to the little example from my daughter's injury, the uncertainty is going to be what? Or the uncertainty was whether or not there's a fracture, right? The decision that could change, in her case didn't change, was how long would you cast? Like, would you cast or not, and for how long, right? I was always going to be casting it for 2.5 or 2 weeks. And then the information source was the actual X-ray itself, right? And so that's how you read these. Now, talking about the decision and risk timeline, right? So returning to the fundamental of VOI, which is VOI is the value of the information or the value of the asset with the new information minus the value of the asset without. Let's talk about first without the new information, right? So when you start up D-Trio and go into any one of the VOI steps, you'll see that the uncertainty table is already pre-populated for you. So we talk about what the future impact decision is in our Go Now. This is where most of the decisions live, right? So if you think through some of the projects that you're looking at now, you typically land right at this blue row, right, where you see the blue row header on the left side. We go now without new information. You make a decision now, and you live with it, and you see what happens afterwards. That's what this means. You make a decision now, you live with it, and you see what happens afterward, right? So let's take this into, I'm just going to change it here. Let me, I'm going to close these guys out. Right. We have our uncertainty, and our uncertainty was, is there a diagenesis? Here we go, in the X-ray location. Right, and then our decision now is whether or not we would drill X-ray. Right, so we drill X-ray and then we find out whether or not there's diagenesis, and to what degree. Right, and the perfect information, 100% reliable. Right, let's just say I'm going to bring in a separate little spacer, a separate little decision here, and this is just get information. I'm not going to say which one in particular, but we're going to get information, because we're going to build out an imperfect information for each one of the other information sources, right? And let me just change the color of this guy to make it more like an information source. We get the information. It tells us, right, whether or not there's diagenesis in it, right? So it's essentially an interpretation here. Because it's not the actual outcome, we're going to change the color of it, and we're just going to say that it would be the interpretation of diagenesis. So interpretation of diagenesis. Right. Let me move this guy down for now. This one is diagenesis at the X-ray location. So let me backtrack a little bit. We get the information. It's perfect information, so it tells us if there is diagenesis in the X-ray, right? And if not, what we would do, whether or not we would drill. So our decision is still the same, to drill or not, right? And so it's perfect information, meaning it tells us what there is, so there's no further uncertainty after we make the decision, because it tells us right at the front, right? But in reality, we are getting the information, and in this particular case, we're going to say, the log from Simon, imperfect information, logs, I'm just going to call it logs only, right? We make a decision, do we get the logs, right? And then it gives us an interpretation of diagenesis. And then we have to choose based on whether or not we think that it is, that whether or not we trust the interpretation, we will make a decision if we want to drill the X-ray or not, right? So let me drill the X-ray, and then at the end, after we drill it, we find out if there's diagenesis or not. Right, the interpretation of the logs is going to be slightly different than the interpretation of the logs plus core. Why? Because as we stated in the previous portion, there is a higher reliability in the logs plus core. Right, so let's grab that. Logs plus core is gathering the information. We're going to copy that and say logs plus core. Oops, I didn't mean to delete it. Change the color to information, and again, it's the interpretation of the diagenesis, and it's a little bit different because it's a different information source. But then drilling X-ray or not as a decision that it impacts, and then we find out what kind of diagenesis there is, right? So ultimately, what this is doing is it's saying, how can we define, if you will, what is the value of my project without new information, which is the go now, and then how can I define the value of the project with the new information, along with its reliability, right? So that's really critical, because the reliability has a very important impact on the value of the assets, right? On the value of the VOI itself, right? Okay, so let's pause here, and we're going to switch over to treetop, and this is where we're going to build out the trees. Okay, and 1 second, let's go here. So let's build out a tree. I think we already had one there. There we go. New tree. Okay, so this is where we're starting. And we have a wizard in Treetop. This is, again, so Treetop is our decision frameworks proprietary software. And this is meant for the evaluation of uncertainties in whatever model you're evaluating, whether it's strictly a subsurface model or if it's an economic model with some subsurface and surface and policy and whatever other uncertainties are built in that could give you a glimpse from a deterministic evaluation, and it runs multiple iterations by substituting values into different inputs and collecting those results and compiling them all into a very insightful illustration, right? Which is some of what you're going to see today. Again, this is just a 1-hour webinar, so we don't want to have time to go into all the details, but here's where we are. So starting with the new tree, we're going to start with the new VOI tree, right? And this process, this is what we call the VOI wizard. It walks you right through. You see step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It walks you right through how to set up this VOI evaluation, right? So the uncertainty that we're trying to evaluate, if we go back and let me just do a little refresher. What uncertainty are we evaluating is the diagenesis, and we're looking at information from either logs or logs plus core, right? So the uncertainty is diagenesis. If we say no diagenesis, there's a 10% chance that there's none. There's a 70% chance that it's slight diagenesis. And then there is a 70% chance that there is severe diagenesis. All right, so it automatically calculates that. This is my state of nature today. This is what we think is happening in the X-ray location today, right? And so I'm just going to, for clarity here. Okay, so you see that the uncertainty today came across into this reliability tree, right? So these are two reliability trees. The first one, or this is one reliability tree, but really with the time 0 and time 1 view, right? So the first one, we talk about the interpretation of no diagenesis when we're talking about the logs only, right? And so, in fact, let me back up a bit. Let me just build out the perfect tree. If it's perfect information, if we were able to collect some kind of information, I don't want to call it logs, and I don't want to call it core plus logs, because I don't want to anchor on these particular ones. Let's just say that some magic test to tell us exactly what's happening in the subsurface, right? Be 100% reliable. So when there's no diagenesis, it's going to interpret that there's no diagenesis. When there's slight diagenesis, it's going to interpret slight diagenesis at 100% of the time. And if it's severe, it's going to interpret severe 100% of the time, right? And so this is what's going to give us our perfect information tree. And why do we need it? I know I mentioned it pretty quickly, but the perfect information tree gives us an upper bound of what the total value of the information could actually be, the total value of the information. So go, in this case example, means drilling the X-ray well, right? And then the don't go is just don't drill the X-ray well, right? So we need to decide whether or not we're going to drill the well based on the information that we have, right? So Treetop is built really to, you can use it either as a standalone, which is what we're doing here for this VOI, or you can use it as a bolt-on, not a bolt-on to Excel, but it brings in Excel, uses it as its add-in so they can run all those iterations, which we don't need to do now for an economic evaluation. What we need to do is just look at these potential rewards here. So we're going to type them in. This is 84 MPV. And if there's no diagenesis, let me see what the other values were supposed to be. 1 second here. $54.18 and -8.1. Thank you. $54.18 and -8.1, and 0 if we don't have anything. Okay. Now the last step here in the wizard is just to look at the overall schematic, which we'll be able to better dive into once we look at the actual tree itself. So from left to right, what does it mean? Getting the information, let's talk about this. This is logs in, well, this one's perfect information, sorry. Perfect info, whatever that means. Get perfect info or don't get any info at all, right? If we don't get any information at all, I'm going to change this view to my presentation view to make it a little bit cleaner. If we don't get any information at all, this bottom part, I'm going to highlight. This whole part is essentially my go now. My go now says, with the uncertainty that we're facing of there being no diagenesis only 10% of the time, which is a favorable outcome, slight diagenesis 20% of the time, which is the not so favorable but not negative outcome, and then lastly, 70% chance of severe diagenesis with a negative outcome, then my project worth is 3.3 million. With my go now is $3.3 million. Right now, with perfect information all the way through, it could be worth up to $9 million. Right. So with that and where you get that, where you see that uplift from, is the information has a power to change my decision. As you can see from my go now, there's no change in decision. There's a drill the X-ray well. There's no change in the top two options, but there is a change if we interpret the severe diagenesis, because we would change our decision to not drill the X-ray well. So we would save ourselves this chance of it being negative, right? And so obviously if it's perfect information, it tells you that it's severe, you wouldn't drill. So that gives you that upper bound, right? And so as we look into here, let me add my VOI value there. Okay, so I've added the VOI of the perfect information. My base is not getting the information at all, right? So what's perfect information worth it to me? $5.6 million. So if there would be a test that'd be 100% reliable, I shouldn't pay more than $5.67 million for it, just based on these economics of the potential outcome. Obviously, there's further uncertainty behind this, but we're looking at a deterministic mid-case as an example for each one of these outcomes. Okay, so now let's build out quickly. Let's build out the new, this is perfect info. And we're going to build out a tree for the imperfect information, right? So we want a new tree. Take off those guys and start from the very beginning of the node. But we want a new VOI tree. Okay, and this will be the last one that we build out, and then we're going to go into the Q&A. Node diagenesis 10, slight diagenesis, there'll be 20, and then severe diagenesis at 70%. Okay, and this is where things get interesting, right? Because this is a 60% chance of the interpretation, right? There's 20/20 distribution of the misinterpretation, right? And then hitting at the 60% and the correct, right? That's when I mentioned the Bayesian inversion. That's how we get to this the new chance of once we update our probabilities. And same thing here. This is drill X-ray. If we choose to go drill X-ray well, and then to not drill the X-ray well, and the same rewards: 54, 18, negative 8.1, and then 0. Okay, as we look at the view, getting a message real quick, let me see. Okay, there we go. What is the value of the information at this reliability? Right, this information, let me just rewrite this. This is logs only. And then don't get logs. Right, we're able to compare the two. The VOI of logs only is 1.6 million. So if we can get logs for less than 1.6 million, then we're good. Okay, so I realize that we're running out of time. So I'm going to pause it here for the Q&A. And let me just get back to the slides. I'll show you what that final here we go. What the final tree was going to look like with the logs plus core, right? So where we left off at was logs at Simon. And that's my 1.6 VOI of logs only. And then if we collect logs plus core with the extra reliability of the interpretation, you see that the VOI goes up from having more value. In other words, increasing your likelihood of a better outcome or decreasing your likelihood of a suboptimal outcome. So closing remarks is VOI is not as difficult, and with this audience that we have, geophysicists and geoscientists, you're used to seeing this level of evaluation. The question is, how can you put it together fairly quickly? Obviously, Treetop is an excellent tool to be able to do that, and to do that, you just have to have some understanding or some better view of what the potential economics is on the back end, so you can see what the value of the information is on that front end of the tree. Okay, so thank you for that, and I'm going to turn it over to SEA.
Great. So I want to remind my audience that you're muted, but if you want to ask questions, you can type your questions in the GoToWebinar question feature. And we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Later today, you'll receive a link to a recording of the webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to register for either Introduction to Decision Framing for Project Management, scheduled for January 21st, 2025 in SEA's Training Center, or Justifying Data, Value of Information course, scheduled for February 18th, 2025. Both of these courses will be taught by Louise Mendoza and Ellen Cooper-Smith. It looks like we've had some really great information today. Talk more about the value of bringing teams together for the discussion that goes along with putting together this VOI evaluation.
Well, I can tell you from my experience that with the VOI, for example, this kind of approach with this min kit, and I'm just going to call it like a 1 hour to a max half day evaluation. What it does is, if it determines that this particular information that's being considered wouldn't necessarily change the decision, then just think of the amount of time that you can save in project execution, whether it be exploration or appraisal. The time that you would save, and then the quicker that you could bring on, you could execute the actual development, for example, and the quicker that you can bring on production, right? That has a significant value in being able to do that. Now, sometimes teams do factor that into the NPV of the information of like the no-go, and so that's really critical to know. If it wouldn't change a decision, what would it be, right? What would you do now, right? Because that time savings could be significant. Oftentimes, and particularly with G&G teams, I see that there's certainly an appetite, there's a high appetite for more information. And I understand it, right? It helps reduce uncertainty or whatnot. But sometimes that uncertainty doesn't necessarily need to be reduced, meaning you already have enough confidence in being able to move forward with whatever the development plan is, right? Or appraisal into development plan, right? So I think that's an important consideration as well.
Exactly. And you mentioned you want to avoid value destruction. What do you mean by value destruction?
Thank you. So value destruction, in terms of understanding what the potential outcomes is reducing the potential of negative outcomes, right? And so to reduce that potential negative outcomes, obviously that's what G&G as a discipline is intended to do for the upstream industry. But if you can reduce the likelihood of those negative outcomes, which obviously are going to be in part out of our control, but if we can reduce the likelihood of those negative outcomes, it means that, probabilistically speaking, over time we're going to have less suboptimal outcomes, and those suboptimal outcomes are those value destruction comments or that's why the value destruction comments that we made.
Right, and I guess sometimes if one continues to gather information and the decision's already made, just the expense of gathering the information causes the value to drop.
Of course, yeah, and the flip side of what I just mentioned in the previous question about accelerating to a development plan, if you then delay a development plan, then there's some value erosion in that time lapse as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for a very interesting presentation today, and we hope everyone will sign up for one of the courses early next year. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody.